Welcome to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
Today, we are jumping into a notice of proposed rulemaking, an NPRM from the FAA.
Right. Basically, the FAA saying, hey, we're thinking about changing some rules. This one dropped July 24th, 2023.
Exactly. And it covers quite a bit: light sport aircraft, experimental stuff, pilot certification, whole load of things.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive. Our main source for this deep dive is, well, the actual FAA document itself. That PDF, 2023-14425.pdf.
Gives us a direct look at their thinking.
Yep, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
So our mission today is basically to unpack the big proposed changes, talk about why they might be happening, and, what it could mean for everyone involved.
Sounds good. We want to make these complex regs a bit easier to grasp.
All right, let's dive in. First up, light sport category aircraft. Sounds like the FAA is planning a pretty significant evolution here.
Evolution's a good word. Maybe even a transformation. They're really proposing to expand what these aircraft can be.
Okay, like how? I saw something about stall speed.
Yeah, that's a key one. They're proposing a higher maximum stalling speed for the airplanes in this category.
Which, initially sounds maybe less safe. Higher stall speed.
Right, it seems counterintuitive. But the thinking behind it seems to be that it allows for more robust airframes.
Ah, okay. So stronger planes that could handle more.
Exactly. More safety equipment, potentially more fuel. And this is a big one. Maybe up to 4 seats, including the pilot.
4 seats? In a light sport? Wow, that's a jump from the usual, too.
It's a significant shift, yeah.
Yeah.
And it ties into this idea of making them more, well, useful.
And they're not stopping there, are they? I saw mention of engines and props.
No, they're proposing removing quite a few limitations, like no longer restricted to just a single reciprocating engine. And they're looking at allowing controllable pitch propellers, even retractable landing gear.
Retractable gear on a light sport. Okay, that's definitely blurring the lines with more complex aircraft.
It is. And get this, they're even proposing getting rid of the rule that says you have to display light sport on the aircraft.
Really? Just take the label off.
Seems like it. It really feels like they want this category to integrate more smoothly into the rest of general aviation.
So what's the bottom line for someone listening? What's the impact for me?
Well, the big picture is you could start seeing a new wave of light sport aircraft that are just more capable, more versatile.
Better for trips, maybe. Personal travel.
Potentially, yeah. And definitely could impact flight training. Those 4 seats, if that happens, could be a game changer for flight schools or families wanting to fly together.
Right. Makes them potentially more practical for short hops.
Definitely could. It broadens the appeal, potentially.
Okay, so the planes themselves might change. What about how they're used? You mentioned commercial operations.
Yeah, that's another interesting angle. They're proposing to allow light sport aircraft in certain kinds of aerial work.
Aerial work. Remind me what that covers?
Generally, it's work done from the air for money, but not carrying people or property for hire. Think pipeline patrol, maybe some survey work.
Gotcha. Stuff where the plane is the platform, not the transport.
Exactly. But the key is, the aircraft would need to meet FAA-accepted consensus standards specifically for that kind of work.
So industry standards that the FAA signs off on for, say, power line inspection using a light sport.
Precisely. It opens doors, but with safety checks built in through those standards.
Makes sense. And I saw that they were also clarifying rules for restricted category aircraft, too. Seemed like a lot of detail there.
Yeah, they're basically proposing to codify or, formally list a lot of the special uses that have often been approved case by case.
Like what kind of uses?
Well, for agriculture, they list things like insect control, dust control, even fruit drying or frost control with aircraft.
Huh. Interesting.
And under conservation, things like aerial firefighting, support dropping materials, fish spotting, wildlife surveys, oil spill response,
Okay.
plus more detailed categories for aerial surveying and patrolling.
So it's less about new uses and more about making the rules clearer for existing specialized operations.
That seems to be the main thrust. Formalizing it, providing clear guidelines, making it more consistent.
Okay, so the impact there is clearer rules for operators and maybe, down the line, seeing light sport potentially used in some of these aerial work roles if the standards get developed and accepted.
That's the potential pathway, yes.
All right, let's shift gears to safety, foundational stuff. The proposals touch on design and safety standards for these potentially beefed up light sport aircraft.
Absolutely central. They're proposing new design and manufacturing requirements specifically to handle these increased capabilities safely.
And they use the term performance-based. What does that mean in practice?
It means the FAA is focusing more on the outcome the aircraft has to perform safely, rather than dictating every single design choice. They set the safety target.
So define the what, not necessarily the how.
Exactly. And the goal they state is a safety level that's sort of in between experimental aircraft and the more stringently regulated normal category aircraft.
Okay, so more oversight than a home built, but maybe not quite the same level of detailed regs as a Cessna 172 going through initial certification.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. The focus is heavily on controllability and maneuverability,
Meaning,
meaning the aircraft has to be predictable, stable, controllable without needing, superhuman piloting skills, especially to avoid losing control.
right. And materials matter too, I assume, especially with potentially wider operating conditions.
Big time. They're emphasizing material suitability and durability, making sure the stuff the plane is built from can handle the stress, the weather, the environment over its life.
Makes sense. What about inside the cockpit? Instruments, equipment?
The proposal mandates the necessary instruments and equipment for safe flight under all the conditions it's approved for.
Standard stuff, but important.
Yep. And they also mention accessibility of controls and displays, making sure pilots can easily reach and use everything smoothly. Human factors stuff.
Good. Thinking about the pilot interface, I also saw something about fire safety after a crash.
Yes, minimizing fire hazards after a survivable emergency landing. That means designing fuel systems, electrical systems, to better withstand impact forces without, spilling fuel or causing sparks.
Crucial for occupant safety and visibility.
Also key, pilots need to see. So requirements for good visibility of instruments, controls, safety placards inside, and a clear view outside to see and avoid.
Can't fly safely if you can't see, and clear placards and markings are part of that.
Definitely. Providing vital warnings and operating info right where the pilot needs it.
And finally, testing. Ground and flight testing seem to be getting a closer look.
Yes, there are proposed requirements to ensure the aircraft is built right and operates safely throughout its intended envelope.
Including any specific aerial work it's designed for.
Absolutely. If it's meant for, say, survey work according to a standard, the testing needs to validate it. You can do that safely.
So overall, the aim seems to be more robust, thoroughly tested, and ultimately safer light sport aircraft coming onto the market.
That's certainly the intended outcome of these enhanced standards.
Okay, let's talk about the pilots flying these potentially more capable machines. Sport pilots, specifically. What changes are on the table for their training and certificates?
This is another area with some potentially really big changes. The FAA is proposing expanded privileges for sport pilots.
Like what?
Well, potentially operating aircraft with those automated controllable pitch props we mentioned,
Okay.
and even flying aircraft with up to 4 seats.
The four-seat thing again. But sport pilots could fly them.
With specific training and endorsements logged, yes. That's the proposal.
That would be a significant expansion for sport pilots. What about night flying? That's generally off limits now, right?
Mostly, yeah. But they're proposing a pathway for sport pilots to get night flying privileges.
How would that work?
It involves new training requirements, minimum night flight hours, night cross-country time, specific numbers of night takeoffs and landings.
So, dedicated night training.
Exactly. And there's a medical component, too. You'd need at least a third-class medical or meet the basic med requirements, valid driver's license, etc.
Wow, night flying could really boost the utility of a sport pilot certificate.
Hugely. Opens up a lot more flexibility.
I also saw a mention of simplified flight controls. What's that about? Sounds futuristic.
It kind of reflects where technology is going. They're proposing regs for aircraft designed with controls that might not look like the traditional yoke and rudder pedals.
More automated, maybe? Fly-by-wire type systems in smaller planes?
Could be. Things relying more on electronics or different interfaces. To fly these, pilots would need specific training and an endorsement.
And your pilot certificate might actually specify what kind of simplified controls you're qualified on.
That's the idea. So if you train on System X, your certificate might limit you to System X until you get trained on System Y. Ensures proficiency with the specific tech.
Interesting. Tailoring the license to the tech, what about helicopters?
Another potential new privilege for sport pilots. Rotorcraft helicopter. Yeah, with its own specific experience requirements, minimum helicopter flight hours, specific training areas, solo time focusing on heliport ops, hovering, that kind of stuff.
So a dedicated pathway for sport pilot helicopter ratings.
Looks like it. And one more thing on adding ratings.
Yeah.
It seems adding an airplane single engine or that new helicopter privilege to an existing sport pilot certificate might get a bit more rigorous.
How so?
They're proposing requiring a full practical test, like the check ride you take for your initial license, using the Airman Certification Standards, ACS, instead of just a proficiency check.
Ah, so a more formal evaluation.
Right. The FAA says this reflects the increased capabilities of the aircraft involved and ensures a more standardized, thorough assessment.
Okay, so bigger privileges potentially available, but maybe a slightly higher bar for adding some of them. Overall, though, sounds like a net expansion for sport pilots with the right training.
Definitely seems that way. More utility, more options, provided you put in the work and demonstrate the skills.
Let's switch to the maintenance side. Keeping these planes flying right. What about the repairman certificates for light sport? Any changes proposed there?
Yes, they're looking to update the requirements for getting and keeping those light sport repairman certificates.
In what way?
A key change is aligning the training courses more closely with the Mechanic Airman Certification Standards the ACS used for A&P mechanics.
So, bringing the training standards closer together.
Kind of. It signals a shift away from just hitting specific training hour numbers or focusing only on certain aircraft classes.
Towards what?
Towards actually demonstrating the knowledge, the risk management skills, the practical abilities needed for the specific category of light sport aircraft. More performance-based training, you could say.
Less box checking, more proving you can do the job safely.
That's the idea. And they're also adding requirements for the training providers themselves, making sure they have proper facilities, the right equipment, materials, qualified instructors. Pretty standard stuff for quality control.
And the providers would have to issue a certificate of completion.
Yes, a formal certificate after the student successfully finishes the course and assessments. Standardizes the proof of training.
Okay. I also saw a note about repairmen with an inspection rating. What was that clarification?
Right. The FAA is making it clear that repairmen with an inspection rating are intended to do the annual condition inspections on the new standard light sport aircraft, the ones certificated under the proposed Section 21.190 rules.
Why that distinction?
It seems to maintain a separation between routine maintenance and the more in-depth annual inspection, likely for an extra layer of safety oversight.
Got it. So overall, these changes aim for more standardized, potentially more thorough training for light sport repairmen.
Which should ultimately contribute to the ongoing safety of the fleet, yes.
Staying on that theme, keeping planes airworthy, let's talk maintenance rules and operating limits. There were a couple of interesting proposed tweaks there.
There were. One pretty significant proposal is removing the requirement for owners-operators to comply with safety directives issued by the manufacturer.
Whoa, okay. That sounds like a big change. Does that mean ignoring safety issues?
Not exactly. It's crucial to remember that complying with FAA Airworthiness Directives ADs, which are mandatory, still applies. That doesn't change.
Okay, so FAA mandates still rule. What's the thinking behind dropping the manufacturer directive requirement then?
The FAA's rationale seems to be that the consensus standards themselves should drive manufacturers to issue safety info when needed, and the basic rule to maintain the aircraft in an airworthy condition still exists anyway.
So they feel existing regs and the standards process are enough without that specific mandate.
That appears to be their thinking, yes. It's a bit of a philosophical shift.
Interesting. What about minor repairs?
Ah, yes. Currently, the rules can sometimes be read as needing manufacturer or FAA approval, even for minor repairs or alterations done by certified mechanics or repair stations.
Which can be a hassle, I imagine.
It can add steps. So the FAA is proposing to amend this to explicitly allow qualified mechanics, repairmen, or repair stations to do minor repairs and alterations without needing that specific prior authorization.
Okay, potentially streamlining things for owners and maintenance shops.
Could make things a bit more flexible, yeah.
And the other point was about experimental aircraft operating over populated areas. That's always a sensitive topic.
It is. The FAA is proposing a potential pathway for the administrator to grant specific operating limitations, allowing certain experimental aircraft under Section 21.191 to operate over densely populated areas or in congested airways.
Under what conditions? That sounds like a major exception.
It would be very specific and controlled. Think of maybe allowing takeoffs and landings from airports in denser areas.
Yeah.
But, and this is a big summer, but only for aircraft that can demonstrate significant safety attributes and have a solid safety record.
So not just any experimental plane.
Definitely not. They'd look at things like, does it still conform to its original design? Have alterations been properly tested? Did it complete a rigorous flight test program?
So a high bar to clear.
A very high bar. And importantly, the general rule prohibiting most experimentals over dense areas still applies to aircraft that don't get these specific individual authorizations.
So it's a cautious, case-by-case potential exception for proven designs, not a blanket permission slip.
Exactly. A measured approach to potentially allow a bit more flexibility for certain well-established experimental types while keeping safety paramount.
Okay, that makes more sense. Now, for something completely different, space support vehicles, that sounds cool. What's the FAA proposing there?
Yeah, this is definitely looking towards the future. They're proposing to formally define and regulate space support vehicle flights.
And a space support vehicle is?
Basically, an aircraft with an experimental certificate that's used as part of a space launch or reentry system.
Huh?
Think like the carrier aircraft for space planes or vehicles used for high-altitude training that simulate spaceflight.
Ah, like Virgin Galactic's mothership or
Ah,
similar concepts?
that kind of thing, yes. The proposed rules would limit their operations to a single licensed launch or reentry site run by a licensed operator,
And what would these flights be for?
primarily for simulating spaceflight conditions. So training potential space tourists, astronauts, crew members, or for research and development related to spaceflight tech.
So not for carrying paying passengers point to point like an airline.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And importantly, the proposal explicitly excludes these space support vehicle flights from the usual air carrier certification rules in Part 119.
Recognizing they're a totally different beast.
Exactly. It's about creating a specific, tailored regulatory framework for this emerging niche in aerospace.
Fascinating to see regulations trying to keep pace with that kind of innovation. Okay, let's circle back to something we mentioned earlier, consensus standards. The FAA might change how they define that term.
Yeah, there's a proposal to either revise the definition of consensus standard or maybe even remove it from Part 1 of the regulations entirely.
Why? What's the issue with the current definition?
The current definition is pretty closely tied just to the light sport aircraft category. But these industry-developed standards are used much more broadly now.
So revising it would make it apply more widely.
Potentially, yes.
Yes.
Or the alternative idea removing it rests on the thinking that consensus standard is a pretty well understood term across aviation and government anyway, so maybe it doesn't need a specific definition in the baseline regs.
Either way, the FAA will still use them.
Oh, yeah. They'll continue to review and formally accept consensus standards developed by industry. They'll publish notices when they accept a standard.
So that process of FAA review and acceptance remains key.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's how a standard developed by, say, ASTM becomes formally recognized by the FAA as meeting their performance-based requirements for design, manufacturing, maintenance, etc.
So bottom line, industry standards will continue to play a huge role, especially in the light sport world, regardless of how the term itself is defined in the regs.
That's the key takeaway, yes.
All right, almost wrapping up. Let's touch on noise regulations, always an important factor in the timelines for all this stuff.
Right. Noise is definitely part of the picture. Under the proposal, new light sport aircraft certified under these new rules would have to meet the noise requirements in Part 36.
What about existing light sport planes?
They'd essentially be grandfathered in. If they already have their airworthiness certificate before the new rules take effect, they won't retroactively become subject to Part 36 unless they undergo a major alteration that significantly changes their noise signature.
Okay, that's a common approach.
Yeah.
Any flexibility for new designs?
Yes, the FAA is proposing some flexibility for applicants seeking special airworthiness certificates. They might be able to show noise compliance using a mix of current regs, older regs, accepted standards, or consensus standards.
Trying to accommodate innovation.
Seems like it, giving pathways for designs that might not fit neatly into the existing boxes. The long-term effect, though, should be that newer light sport aircraft entering the fleet will generally be quieter.
Makes sense. And finally, the big question, when might all these changes actually happen? It's not immediate, right?
No, there's a proposed timeline. For most of the rule changes, the effective date would be 2 months after the final rule gets published in the Federal Register.
Okay, pretty quick for most parts.
But for the parts that depend on new or revised consensus standards being ready.
Like some of the aerial work stuff or design standards.
Exactly. And also for the updated repairman training requirements. For those bits, they're proposing a longer effective date, 6 months after the final rule is published.
Giving industry and training providers time to catch up.
Precisely. Acknowledging that standards need to be written, adopted, reviewed, and training programs need to be updated and implemented. So some pieces will take a bit longer to fall into place.
Got it. So a phased approach depending on the complexity and reliance on external factors like standards.
That's right.
Well, this has been a really thorough journey through a pretty dense proposal. Let's try and quickly recap the highlights.
Yeah, I mean, the big picture is this looks like a major effort by the FAA to modernize the rules for light sport and experimental aircraft.
Really aiming to boost safety, right? But also increase what these aircraft can do.
Exactly. Enhance safety, expand functionality, make them more versatile, and also create pathways for new technologies to fit into the regulatory system.
And some of those potential changes are really eye-catching. The idea of four-seat light sport planes.
Yeah, that's a big one. Plus the expanded potential for aerial work using light sport aircraft.
And that whole framework for space support vehicles.
Hmm.
Really looking ahead there.
Definitely signals where things might be headed.
For anyone listening who wants to get into the real nitty-gritty, the full NPRM document is the place to go.
Absolutely. You can find it on regulations.gov. Just search for docket FAA 2023-14425. All the details are in there.
It's worth a look if any of these specific areas really affect you.
For sure.
Okay, so that brings us to our final thought to leave folks with.
Given everything we've discussed, the potential for more capable planes, new uses, updated training, new tech pathways, how might all this truly reshape the landscape of personal flying and maybe those specialized air operations in the next, say, 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, what kind of innovation might these rule changes unlock that maybe we haven't even thought of yet?
It's definitely something interesting to ponder. What new doors might open up?